what I hope to introduce is a little bit, just a little bit of the thinking which is running through Lacou-Labarthe, the stuff not beyond. So that's the, as I've told you, the text of 1973, which is a very radically fragmented text. I think it's his most extreme text in some sense. Sometimes it takes on a forbidding abstraction, especially when he's talking about Nietzsche. The Nietzsche sections on the eternal return are just are really difficult, really abstract, and really challenging. And there are other passages where he just doesn't seem. It's as though he's pushing theoretically and pushing to breaking points almost. So it is an extremely it's extremely abstract in many ways, but at the same time, in other respects, very powerfully concrete when he goes into the more literary elements of it. Lacou-Labarthe is not a theoretical text, I think in any way, in any appropriate way of using that term. And the most immediate evidence of that is that this title, Lacou-Labarthe, barely appears in the text. Or, I'm overstating it. It's maybe somewhere between a dozen and 20 times in the course of 200 and some pages do you see a reference to Lacou-Labarthe. And sometimes that's impassable when the phrase is broken up in some way or alluded to. So, in some curious sense, the book doesn't take Lacou-Labarthe as some sort of theme or some sort of guiding motif, or it's the title doesn't really entitle or stand over this book in any sense. And Lacou-Labarthe is in effect never defined. There is no conceptual definition. He more or less he brings it into articulation at certain points. He brings it in. He makes the phrase work at certain points in the text. So, in a sense, we have to ask how it's working at various moments, and what happens when it comes into the text. What is being articulated. And it's you simply will not get a definition of Lacou-Labarthe in Lacou-Labarthe. So it is. He invites in that way, and the very first line of the text is, "Let us enter this relation." Entrons dans ce rapport. Let us enter into this relation. The suggestion is that this is Lacou-Labarthe, that we're invited to perform Lacou-Labarthe in some way, to engage it. But again, it is not. It's never taken as an object of a theoretical exposition. It's not a concept. It's a phrase. It's a phrase that certainly has its connotations, but those connotations only work within the context in which the phrase is written. So it is, in that way, it is really it remains very obscure, and it's not in any way. It's not a master signifier in this text. It's again nothing like a title. It seems instead to be, as I say, it's inscribed in the syntax, and in some ways it's like a relay of this movement he's trying to describe. I use relay because I'm trying to talk about this use of language which is not representational or conceptual or thematic. Right? It is relaying a relation. This is what I use a phrase from Walter Benjamin. He speaks of various terms that he uses, such as translatability or communicability or comprehensibility. There's a whole series of terms. of that nature. And he calls them Relationsbegriffe, concepts of relation. And so they are, they talk about the way a text offers itself or lends itself to meaning or translation. And he puts these to work in various contexts. But this is, you can't very well talk about them as concepts. So, Lepaudre has something like a Relationsbegriff.
Could you say that the text is trying to show the step, not beyond, and not say it?
Show it and at the same time perform it.
Yeah.
And the showing is itself of a very complex character, because remember, Blanchot was trying to get to that place where to speak is not to see. So we're outside the realm of a kind of phenomenology where there would be a production or a bringing forth of meaning in such a way that it would be apprehensible or comprehensible. So that again, this is I was trying to suggest what Heidegger is trying to some extent, to lead us away from any understanding as the grasping of a meaning by a subject or something like the mind's eye or some comprehending gaze, and leading us into this movement in language. Blanchot is doing the same thing, but I think he's being a little bit more radical about that notion of appearance, or showing. So there's an insistent concealing and turning away or turning apart from something like a showing. So you have the part that does come up in a few theoretical statements, and I will read a few of these to you. I want to show you this happening. And just comment on them a little bit. But excuse me, it's showing up in a few theoretical statements, but the text is, is constantly interrupting those statements with narrative passages, and narrative passages that vary amongst themselves. It's not always the same story, or it's the same story fragmented in some sense. But even the modalities of narrative relation vary. Again, it's not clear who's speaking, and the evocation of a narrative changes in its way of presenting that narrative. It's a different kind of narrative modality. A lot of it is like the dialogue we read yesterday. When it comes to narrative, there is a conversation, and I think I mentioned this to you. This conversation is between two men who, at a certain point, the room in which they are is emptied out in the way I was describing yesterday, with Blanchot reading Bataille. There's a kind of vacating of this space between, and then in this space between, there a whole set of figural metamorphoses occur. There is a city that appears between them, then a river, and the river is desiccated, and we have a desert, and a deserted city, and a kind of graveyard. And it's from there, it's in that desert that the text approaches its conclusion, where Blanchot has, he makes a kind of opening or a welcoming gesture, which is really quite, it's quite overwhelming. It's quite striking when it comes. He basically finishes the book by saying, "Come, viens," and it's you talk about showing this stuff. It really is performing this passage outside toward others that he has named in the text, without identifying these others. And these others, I would presume, are like perhaps those others in the conversation we were talking about yesterday. Some say you need to live this way, others say, these are the others of this other conversation, others who are in some sense experiencing in this relation to the neutral that he's describing. So the text moves toward, if the last moment of the dialogue we were reading yesterday is to will the interruption, the last moment of this dialogue is having willed that interruption to open to others. So it's a gesture of hospitality, an opening to others that the text has in some sense been seeking to bring into relation, or bring to this site which the text is tracing out. And that sight, I'm going to be coming to that when I read the passage on nature. That sight is prepared by, as the narrator says, he's writing his own death and clearing a space. That space is a in the strictest sense, it is the self opening to the other. But this act of writing almost traces out that sight, that space of exposure, that sight of reception. So the whole text is in that sense a hospitable act, and a hospitable and a going out. And when this follows the structure that I described in that questionnaire from Catherine David, where he says the writer's task is to go out toward the farm, to receive the farm, and in that movement to achieve what he calls a nomadic affirmation. There's a great phrase in Lacou-Labarthe where he says, "Only the nomadic affirmation remains." So it is it's in this movement that he's describing that this affirmation occurs, or this opening occurs, this affirming opening. Come to this place. So the last words are viens. Well, those aren't quite the last words. That's why it was so hard to conclude the reading of that text. They are almost like the penultimate words. The penultimate words are, one figure says, "Come," to the others. And then in the next sequence, the two figures go back to their conversation, and we witness a kind of separation like the one we saw in the dialogue yesterday, where the two are, there's a kind of a jarring difference between them. And in the very last words of Lacou-Labarthe, which it's really very stunning, he says, "May those..." actually, who has the text here? You have. Let me just read that last sentence. That's very useful. Thank you. Look at this clean copy. It's not the very last words, but nearly the very last words. They're in parentheses. And the one, as I said, there seems to be a disjunction, and then there's a description of the passing of one of them, which goes as follows: "He was so calm in dying that he seemed, before dying, already dead, after and forever still alive, in this calm of life for which our hearts beat, thus having effaced the limit at the moment in which it is the limit that effaces." So it's a passage of effacement and into a kind of peace, calm. And then in parentheses, "In the night that is coming, let those who have been united and to efface one another not feel this effacement as an injury that they would inflict on one another." So may this separation that's occurring between us by virtue of effacement not be taken as an injury, or not harm the other. And this has an interesting, reflects back in an interesting way on the dialogue that we've read. The host does not want to implicate the other in this movement by which he's moving toward effacement, because there will be pain in this, right? Pain of various kinds. The pain of implicating the other in the weariness, which is itself pain, and then the pain of effacement or separation. So in friendship there is separation, and as there will always be separation, because we are all moving toward death, and Blanchot affirms that. So let us, as penultimate words, it's quite extraordinary. "Let those who have been united and who efface one another not feel this effacement as an injury that they would inflict on one another." Then the very last words are, "Free me from the too long speech." "Libère-moi de la trop longue parole." May I be freed from words that go on too long. I'm sorry?
What page is that on?
That's on page 137 of the English translation. Let me just read a little bit more of this for your pleasure. what I was trying to say, and I'll be coming back to this, is that the author is writing his death, as I suggested, and this is opening the space for this for this invitation. The allegorical movement of the Trauerspiel, which he describes later in the text when he talks about the image of Golgotha, he says that there's a kind of a speculative excess in this presentation of death, and this works in an allegorical way as a kind of sign toward redemption. I suppose that you could make a link between the desert that Blanchot is describing and the image of Golgotha that is given as sort of the most extreme point of the Trauerspiel's allegorical turn. I'm trying to remember what he says about symbol. I actually cannot remember that, except that, well, in the beginning of the text, there's a fantastic introduction where he talks about the presentation of truth. Doesn't he use the word symbol in that context? I can't remember.
So it has a much.
I think in the central philosophical points of the Trauerspiel was montage and allegory. I'm pretty close to the text, so I don't recall where he really articulates on symbol.
Right, but within that kind of tropological space that you just mapped between an allegory and a montage, my feeling was that there was a logic at work there regarding a montage as, the space of a montage is a thrown togetherness. Different parts all kind of like a mosaic kind of logic. And this etymologically makes, I think the linkage is there with the sim, together, the with, and the ball, which is the same suffix that we find in a problem or a ballistic. It's a thrown. The German would be the Sturm.
Was Blanchot aware of Walter Benjamin's writings?
He would have been to some extent. I don't know how much. Benjamin was in Paris in the late 30s. He was participating in Bataille's. Yeah, he was participating in Bataille's Collège de Sociologie. He was around. How much? This is late 30s, where this is a time where Blanchot is not hanging out with that group very much, and not until the very late 30s. So, but Blanchot was so aware of what was going on in European letters, even in the 30s, but even more, I think, in the 40s. He would have been aware of Benjamin's work. What it is, I don't know exactly. He would have known, because I can't really remember when the Trauerspiel book was published.
25 or 26.
Was it that early?
Yeah.
There's his thesis on romanticism. I'd be very interested to know if
it's 1919.
Blanchot had seen that. Yes, but it wasn't published until much later. So I'd be really interested to know if Blanchot had seen that, because that's all about Hölderlin and romanticism and Schlegel and so forth. And Blanchot is very deeply engaged with that material as he continues, and thinks about fragmentation and so forth. So, yes, I certainly there's a connection, although I don't remember an explicit engagement of Benjamin's work on Blanchot's part. What's striking is that this Benjamin's thinking about language would certainly be bring him close to Blanchot's concerns. So the nature of that is I may be missing something. I may just not be aware of something that is really quite important in that connection, but I'm not aware of a particular case where he talks about that.
If you look at the cognates between the Greek and the German, and there's an interesting kind of unresolved tension for me between an object and a Gegenstand. The object has a sense of being thrown under, the Gegenstand kind of standing against these two don't seem exactly cognate. They don't have the same kind of sense for me. That's a purely speculative.
Except that the object is thrown over and under, against a subject. And there's the Gegen, and Stein would be a positing or a position, right? I mean, that's a connection anyway. All right, let me go then forward. I went off on this idea of the Lacou-Labarthe being a performance, the writing, or the opening of a space, which could become a space of hospitality, by which there could be something like an invitation. Now, I think that in attempting such a, let's call that an allegorical act, Blanchot, I think, is responding to a kind of ethical imperative. He's attempting to, and I'm not sure I like this word ethical, but he's attempting to write in a manner that is, I suppose I could say, genuinely responsible in relation to this exigency he feels he experiences in writing. And so in that respect, this performance of Lacou-Labarthe is meant to achieve a responsible form of writing. And let me tell you why I understand it that way, or part of it anyway. I mentioned that the narrative component is not itself continuous in character. There are different kinds of narratives that appear in the text. At 2 points, there are figures of human beings. The two men in conversation in the room, they're certainly quite human in a way, and actually they're very much like the two men in conversation in the room. But they lack definable traits. We know, remember in that conversation, the one was big, powerful or something, but tired. That's all we know. Nothing about the eyes, the dress, and the way they hold themselves in any precision. Nothing at all. And then in Lacou-Labarthe, there are a couple sequences where figures appear. And there's one in particular which is especially powerful. And I think in some sense it stands alone, and then a subsequent appearance of this figure is just a matter of a couple sentences. What I'm referring to is the appearance of what he calls it, an unknown girl. And I'm going to read this sequence and then comment on it a little bit for you. This, I'm sorry? This is on page, I can hand the text back to you. Are you looking at it?
Yeah.
Okay, it's on 60 to 61. It's a young girl. So in this passage, a man encounters a young girl on the street. And later in the text, very briefly, there's an image. He says that her head is bowed slightly and hair falls down over the face. And that's all we get. Just the image of hair falling over the face of this figure. And one of the really big challenges of the text is try to understand how that appearance of, how this encounter that she describes on the street is playing in relation to the other narrative components. Is there a relation? At one point I suggested it could be that this encounter with the young girl is like the axis around which everything else is turning. Or, that's just one way of looking at that. Or it could be a kind of, what happens is a kind of flashback. There's a strange there's a different kind of visual character to this image than in the other narrative accounts, and it just seems to hit almost like a flashback when the girl's hair falls over her eyes. But it's fascinating. But this one I think is especially important. So let me read this to you. I'm sorry I don't have a photocopy. I should have had this one photocopied, but I think it will be. It's very concrete. In that sense, you should be able to assimilate it. So, I quote, "He who in the street, stops the unknown one with somber eyes and says to her, "I'm afraid, would you accompany me for a moment?" Gives her the movement of fear as a companion forever. But he entrusts his thought to her, the safeguard of this imperiled thought, giving himself over to the unknown, though the unknown has a face, the face of an unknown girl, by an appeal that escapes not only what is fitting in relations, but even the human manner of relating relations, and is thus a mark of what one must call unreason. I'm going to read this twice, and don't worry if you don't quite follow these sentences. Man encounters the girl on the street, says to her, "I'm afraid, would you accompany me for a moment?" And Blanchot's description here suggests the act is a mad act. You encounter someone you don't know in the middle of the street, you say, "I'm afraid, please accompany me." He says this act touches upon the limits of social relation and is perhaps in itself a mad gesture in relation to that unknown person. So there is thus in this a mark of what one must call unreason. One must, he concludes, therefore pass by way of madness, here maintained within the limits of an initiative that is only hazardous, to make a step outside of madness, in the slipping that brushes the outside. Certainly there is something unreasonable in forgetting, in not taking into account, that every human being is not immediately the other, in whom each time trust might be placed, through a word, a murmur difficult to hear of one's thought, which is to say of one's madness. And that when the unknown one receives him in the simplest manner, taking gently by the hand he who has stopped her, and bringing him through the night, as one brings a blind person across the street, that one can conclude nothing from such a movement of reception, from that improbable possibility opened between beings, opened by what could not be shared, a separation of madness. There is what makes reason vacillate anew, while giving it to retain on the condition of concluding nothing from it, of not making sense of it, this shattering that does not belong to it. Any conclusion, any interpretation would be delirium. The temptation for thought of re-establishing a relation of equilibrium between itself and its other. To say, this was a sign of goodness, someone was for me the good, is to deprive this human girl of herself. She who would probably have refused to be called good or be said to have done anything good, being well on this side of and well beyond any goodness. To say, this is how it would be in a perfect society, everyone openly receiving everyone without demanding anything, is to forget that madness or fear would be in some sense forbidden in this society, or placed in the charge of the community itself without any particular person being able, other than by fault, to accept this sick particularity and give it a refuge. To say, he who confides himself absolutely finds already in the limitlessness of trust a response to the entrapped speech, having carried his fear as far as friendship, fraternity without law. This is to make a law of what, having taken place only once, and even for that taking place every time, announces itself as impossible, real, inasmuch as impossible. He who has received this sign knows at once that not only is there no right in this, but that all those who, far from being received as he was, were rejected, sweep him henceforth away with them, with no recourse but the great river. How then can one pretend to acquit oneself of the event in speaking of luck or chance, a word immediately reduced to its indigency, especially when the other is at stake there? So that's on page 60 to 61. Get a chance, go back and read this when you get Lacou-Labarthe in your hands. Let me read it to you again. First, let me summarize what you've heard, and then read it again. So, a man encounters a woman on the street, and he says to her, "I'm afraid. Would you accompany me for a moment?" "I'm afraid" will become a leitmotif in the latter part of the text. There'll be long theoretical reflections on fear. and he will try to draw, this is one of those key affects, and he will draw it out as a relation to the neutral. And he will give us quite a long exposition, and he will come to say that the locution "I am afraid" is not a phrase among other phrases, in as much as fear is being communicated through this way of speaking. And he works at long length with this locution, "I'm afraid." He's trying, in a certain sense, to rip it from everyday language, trying to breach the discourse with this phrase. So it is, when we read it at this point in the text, there have been one or two references to fear, but it's nothing that would perk your ears if you're reading it the first time. You don't realize that there's anything particular about this locution at this point in the text. So it seems to be a perfectly concrete incident, right? A man meets another in the street and says, "I'm afraid, would you accompany me?" But Blanchot immediately insists on the sort of the madness attending this act. I should note, I gave you that one page of the essay, Reflections on Hell. There is something of a similar encounter. Whereby the relation is changed forever, as the way he says it here, and the desert becomes a friend. So it is this communication constitutes a transformation, or constitutes a relation of a kind. This kind of infinite relation that he's describing in the first paragraph of Reflections on Hell. So he addresses her, "I'm afraid." He communicates fear, which, as he says, gives her the movement of fear as a companion forever. That companion is something like the E, which appears in Reflections on Hell. Okay? And in that act, he says, he entrusts his thought to her, asking for her to, in some sense, preserve his thought from the madness that's afflicting it in this movement, as he says, across the night. Across the night, that's very beautiful. It's a little bit like Eurydice asking Orpheus to help her out, right, through the night. He suggested it's a mad act, but it's a mad act in terms of the everyday social relations, which is attempted in order to help him escape from madness. So he says we have to pass through madness in order to, in a certain sense, skirt madness and cross to the other shore. And it is mad, he suggests, that the one would approach the other, assuming that this other will receive him. How could you possibly presume that this young girl will accept this gesture? So there's something insensé is in the French. There's something insane in taking every other for the other, right? When in fact most will not receive in that manner. And that's precisely what he evokes in the last part of the text, which I think is so important, where he says, through this experience, he suddenly has awareness of all those who have been refused, who sweep him away. And then I get an image of, Dante in hell, seeing those vast numbers. I never would have thought death had undone so many, right? and being carried over the river. So there's something mad in his gesture in relation to her, something mad in his assumption. And the narrator suggests that what is equally unsettling, or what he says, what makes thought vacillate, or what makes our understanding, what shakes our understanding, is the fact that we cannot conclude anything from this. So there is her gesture of reception, her hospitality, cannot be instituted in any sense, and this is what will follow also in the preceding paragraph. Cannot understand it as in relation to some ethical law. Cannot understand it in terms of some ideal socio-political order. It is not a comprehensible act on her part to receive the other's fear and to carry him in this hospitality. It's not a reasonable it's not a reasonable thing.
I agree, but why not? Well, what would society say in saying why not? What would society
He wants to keep from instituting it as a law and thereby undoing the singularity of the relation. So, so this entire passage is about undoing any form of subsumption of this event in in some sort of instituted law, which will immediately foreclose the kind of encounter he's describing, which is between two singularities at the very edge of law.
So he wouldn't even want it to be instituted into law in the future.
Exactly. If and that's what he says. If we were to do that, then we would have the perfect society. And should such a singularity occur, well, they would then be criminal, and anybody who would harbor them would be criminal. So there's a kind of preservation of this act or this event from any form of institution, if you will. So he goes on then and says that she's not good, she's not the representative of a perfect society, and we cannot make a law of this reception. I'm going to read this. I'm just going to read this twice. I'm going to read the whole thing after I've commented a little bit. But he says, near the end, he says, to say he who confides himself absolutely finds already in the limitlessness of trust, a response to his entrapped speech. His senses that he's trying to bring out, to express something, and it's almost as though the language is caught up in him. The narrator is saying he cannot see this as a liberation of the speech. So this is not a freeing or a deliverance in any sort of ethico-political sense.
What page are you on?
I'm at page 61. I'm in the very last part of the text. So he says, this would be to make a law of what, having taken place only once, and even for that taking place every time, announces itself as impossible, real as much as impossible. He does not want to institute this. He who has received this sign. So the narrator makes a step here to suggest that the gesture of reception on the part of the young girl cannot be understood in relation to any societal imperative, be it ethical or socio-political. It cannot be understood in any philosophical sense. This is an event in the sense of a singular, impossible reception. He says, but nevertheless, in the act there is still a sign. And so I found myself naming this in the course of trying to think about this, and, with the resonance of this word that I've already used. I call this a sign of exception. In that sense, a sovereign act, if you will. A sign of exception in receiving the other. He who has received this sign knows at once that not only is there no right in this, but that all those who, far from being received as he was, were rejected, sweep him henceforth away with them. What is so striking to me in that is he suggests that should one receive this sign of exception, one knows at the same time all those lost. That there's a knowledge that comes with the exceptional reception, the exceptional act of hospitality, a knowledge of infant loss, of all those who were not so received. They sweep him henceforth away with them, with no recourse but the great river. And I would presume that's forgetting. The only way to deal with this is forgetting. This is linked to a lot of passages where Blanchot he struggles with the question, how do we face the reality of the camps, or the other forms of affliction and oppression in our societies? There's no way to do it. Should you really open to this, you'll go mad. And the only way to deal with it is various levels of forgetting and opening and forgetting. But here at this point, and also the question is, how could one know? And part of what he's saying is, it's in hospitality that knowledge is given. That the relation to all those lost is given to us. And then the last question, how then can one pretend to acquit oneself of the event? And speaking of luck or chance, especially when the other is at stake there, clearly some responsibility has emerged. He has to acquit himself of a debt or something that, a gift that has been given to him for which he is now responsible in some way. And so he immediately makes a turn to criticize his own language in this text, because this text will turn constantly to the issues of luck or chance or contingency to try to think the event. And he'll say, we bring in Mallarmé, we bring in Bataille, we bring in the image of people throwing dice and so on and so forth. Says, yeah, this is very nice, but how can you begin to speak that way when you're talking about all those who have been lost? Right? There's something frivolous, there's something radically insufficient about any kind of theoretical language when it comes to trying to speak to that infinite depth that he's trying to evoke in relation to those who have not been received in friendship or in hospitality. So there's a question is thereby raised in that last sentence, it seems to me. What would be a responsible language, or one by which one might work towards acquitting oneself of this sign of exception, this gift that one has received in the form of that sign of exception? How could one acquit oneself of that hospitality, and not only, in a certain sense, recognize that hospitality and recognize what that hospitality has given, which is this knowledge of so many others. But at the same time, how could one write in such a way as then to give the sign of exception? How could one write hospitably? Having been given this gift, I think he feels enjoined to begin to write in a way that would do precisely what he has just described, what the young girl did for him. In other words, his writing should become should bear the sign of exception in some way. He should, I don't want to say it's produce the sign of exception, but the writing should have the character of a hand coming out, to receive the other in that singular moment. And so then the question is, having developed the utter impossibility of theorizing this, instituting it in any sense, a socio-political or ethical construct, what writing could possibly constitute such a sign of exception and become a responsible writing? Do you follow what I'm saying? How could the writing itself become hospitable? Hospitable to singularity, hospitable to the other in such a way as never to reduce that other to the order of the same, be it an ethical order, a socio-political order, or a conceptual order. How could there be this radical opening to the other? Or how could language trace a relation which would become itself an opening? How could a text such as Lacou-Labarthe be an opening to others, or to the other? And how could it then say at the end, viens, come to this side, or in a kind of abandoned giving over? So I think that I read this. Here's an allegory. This little passage. I read this as posing for us the question of the text.
Which page?
Yeah.
Which page is it?
This is on page, it's 86 in French, 60 and 61 in the English. Let me read it one last time so you hear what. It must be hard to assimilate this, but I hope my explication is made easy. He who in the street stops the unknown one with somber eyes. Again, this is the only time you get an image of a person with eyes, and later on there'll be hair falling down. That's it. He who stops the unknown one with somber eyes and says to her, "I'm afraid, would you accompany me for a moment?" gives her the movement of fear as a companion forever. He's playing with the notion of accompaniment. He wrote a book called The One Who Does Not Accompany Me. He's playing with it. But he entrusts his thought to her, the safeguard of this imperiled thought, giving himself over to the unknown, though the unknown has a face, the face of an unknown girl, by an appeal that escapes not only what is fitting in relations, but even the human manner of relating relations, and is thus a mark of what one must call unreason. One must therefore pass by way of madness, here maintained within the limits of an initiative that is only hazardous, to make a step outside of madness, in the slipping that brushes the outside. Certainly there is something unreasonable in forgetting, in not taking into account that every human being is not immediately the other in whom each time trust might be placed, through a word, barely a word, a murmur difficult to hear, of one's thought, which is to say of one's madness. And that when the unknown one receives him in the simplest manner, taking gently by the hand he who has stopped her, and bringing him through the night, as one brings a blind person across the street, that one can conclude nothing from such a movement of reception, from that improbable possibility opened between beings, opened by what could not be shared, the separation of madness. There is what makes reason vacillate anew, while giving it to retain on the condition of concluding nothing from it, of not making sense of it, this shadow that does not belong to it. Any conclusion, any interpretation would be delirium, the temptation for thought of re-establishing a relation of equilibrium between itself and its other. To say this was a sign of goodness, someone was for me the good, is to deprive this human girl of herself. She who would probably have refused to be called good or be said to have done anything good, being well on this side of and well beyond any goodness. To say this is how it would be in a perfect society, everyone openly receiving everyone without demanding anything, is to forget that madness or fear would be in some manner forbidden in this society, or placed in the charge of the community itself, without any particular person being able, other than by fault, to accept this sick particularity and give it a refuge. To say he who confides himself absolutely finds already in the limitlessness of trust a response to the entrapped speech, having carried his fear as far as friendship, fraternity without law. This is to make a law of what, having taken place only once, and even for that taking place every time, announces itself as impossible, real in as much as impossible. He who has received this sign knows at once that not only is there no right in this, but that all those who, far from being received as he was, were rejected, sweep him henceforth away with them, with no recourse but the great river. How then can one pretend to acquit oneself of the event, in speaking of luck or chance, a word immediately reduced to its indigency, especially when the other is at stake there? So I hope I've gotten that across a little bit, and one thing I didn't comment on as I was passing is the way his insistence that this act on the part of the young girl is a human act. And so I was trying to say, as I was trying to construct these scenes yesterday, I was saying there is the necessity of a human gesture. There's a human share in this relationality, which involves something extra human. And what he's naming madness is on that limit of the human. So a human act of hospitality, which constitutes an event, and in the act there's a sign of receiving. And the question is then, how can that sign be written? I wanted to just look at two things with you from the Pagla now. There's a passage in the Infinite Conversation. Well, sorry, I want to approach the Pagla with the Infinite Conversation. And I'm going to have to read to you. This is a theoretical passage, but it is. It plays out a rather interesting set of steps, which I think reflect on what I was just trying to talk about. How does one write in such a way as to constitute an opening, to write a how does one write a threshold, or and the invitation of that threshold? This is the passage that I had photocopied for you, page 311 of the absence of the book. It's from the Infinite Conversation. It's after Reflections on Hell, that passage. And there are two passages on the neutral. One from pages 303 to 306. You might take a look at that. It's very dense stuff. I was thinking of trying to work through it a little bit with you, but it is really so dense, and you see Blanchot moving through a constant saying, it's not this, it's not that, it's not this, it's not that, always moving back, suspending any determination that one might give to this otherness, this other relation, this other presence, and so on and so forth. And I think sometimes almost this is a performance for us of the act of reason, trying to come to grips with something that exceeds reason's hold. Anyway, there are two sets of these discussions of the neutral that come close to one another. Here's the second set then on page 311. under the title parentheses, and well, part of what's just happened in the discussion of the neutral, he says that there is a kind of parenthetic suspension in the neutral, and so this is, these parentheses belong to this writing of the neutral, and meditation of the neutral. In this, again, we are in a conversation with plus and minus signs, and this seems to be, again, something of a continuation. Two interlocutors are talking about the neutral, and they ask about what is the relation between the neuter or the neutral, and the other, in the sense of the other human being. Or it's not even always entirely clear it's the other human being. It just says the other here, but I think he's referring here to the other human being. And then I don't want to go through all that. It's really very complex and abstract and kind of hard to grasp. But at the end of the second section, one of the voices says, "But wouldn't death play this role?" And let me skip what this role would be. Again, it's going to take us too much time. Coming as other, having the false appearance of the neutral, not allowing itself to be seized as unified, attaining only inasmuch as it remains inaccessible, and thereby rendering inaccessible what it reaches, nevertheless touching only what it has always already touched, having no actuality, and only allowing itself to be encountered by the self that it haunts, when the self, stand-in for the other, is no more than the already broken fictive partner that the other offers itself and receives as a gift. In the opening pages of Lacou-Labarthe, excuse me, Blanchot presents this becoming other of the self, or this breaking up of the self, at long length, in very strong theoretical passages about this. So he'll take over this idea that death is only given to the self that has become other than itself in this fictive movement. That's the becoming fictive that happens in writing. The self thereby agrees to be a kind of, as he says, a stand-in for the other, a singular particularity marking our relation to the outside. So suddenly a suggestion comes, or a conclusion, or a next step. Inscribe your death then. If death is this relation, I use relation, all sorts of quotation marks. Inscribe your death then, in a region where it would not be marked as a lack, a region that would be so separate from the other regions of discourse that they would be unable to be captured as separate, even in order to designate it as such, and in designating it, relinquish or resign it. So he's talking about the relation between what it would be to write this relationality of one's dying, and any theoretical or any other kind of discursive articulation. For discourse in general, that is to say, in the region where death is inscribed as a zero of meaning, a subtraction subtracted, the lack that is marked by death would not fail to touch, all the while leaving intact, the concept of truth, as well as the concepts of subject and unity, which are deposed by it from their primary position. In this way, and at this very moment, discourse nonetheless maintains for itself the illusion of the true and the illusion of the subject, illusions with which it plays so that the ungraspable true and the subject, always supposed alienated, can still ensure discourse of its perpetual fall short. I'm not going to, we could pause and try to understand. Some of this is a bit challenging, but he's really attempting to separate this kind of writing from any kind of any discursive construct where in our accepted senses of articulating meaning. I seek the distance without concept, in order that death without truth may be inscribed there. Which tends to say that dying, so suddenly we go from a sort of a statement or acceptance to almost a commentary on it, which tends to say that dying, rather than signifying failure, might delimit a region in which the effective truth would not even be marked as a lack. Admitting a notion of science, then, as an exact writing that lacks nothing, we would suppose it capable, and solely capable, of specifying at what site writing and dying would be superimposed or articulated together. But science, la science, how could it of itself admit this simple unity? that ideally totalizes it and gives it once again over to ideology. This is it's a question about, if you remember what I was saying about the human sciences and the discourse that's going on when Blanchot is writing this, he's worrying about the relation between literary writing, or this kind of inscription that he's trying to think, and the kind of writing that Althusser was envisioning, or Lacan, or the others. So and also Derrida. Derrida at this moment was playing with the idea of a grammatology. And of course, grammatology sort of constructs the possibility of a science and then undoes it, in a very playful movement in the first part of the book by that name. But there is an interview where Derrida says that we might envision a science, a more powerful science of the trace. And so he's tempted by the idea of bringing this thinking into some form of, let's just say, a coherence that would answer to the term science.
Derrida,
Derrida says that.
But not Blanchot.
No, I think Blanchot is refusing that.
Yeah.
In discourse, through discourse, and at a distance from discourse, the line of demarcation invisibly traces itself. A line that, withdrawing from discourse any power to totalize, assigns it to multiple regions. A plurality that does not tend to unity, be it in vain, nor that is constructed with relation to unity, as lying to its hither side or beyond, but that has always already set it aside. The scientificity of science does not consist in its reflection on a unity of essence, but on the contrary, in a possibility of writing that each time distinct frees the word science from every prior unity of essence and of meaning. So here he's playing with the idea of the scientificity of science, receiving this thought of writing, or the trace. Again, this is would seem to be referring to Derrida.
Was he a reader of Derrida?
Absolutely.
So, at this point in time, was he aware of science structure and play?
Yes.
And this.
I'm trying to remember which, he would have read the early texts. Writing Indifference of Grammatology would be out by this time, as I remember. Derrida was publishing essays and critique and so on. So it was, he received Derrida's work quite early.
So, is he very close on the question of the trace?
Well, what he's doing right now, look at this, listen to the next sentence. Nonetheless, literature, through which there is no speech that is not already destined to writing, sets itself apart from science by means of its own ideology, which can only have the illusion of deposing by reinforcing it. But also, and above all, here is literature's always decisive importance, by denouncing as ideological the faith that science, through an implacable allegiance and for its salvation, pledges to identity and to the permanence of science, a lure, irreproachable decoy.
Yeah.
I would have to link this to other conversations in Lacou-Labarthe in particular to really bring out the impact. But I think he's saying, no, we cannot have a grammatology that would host this writing. That this writing detaches itself, and in the slippage involved in language that is put into play, we could never have a scientific account.
But science needs identity and permanence of science.
Yes. Yeah. So, then he continues, thus we have, perhaps, better indicated the neutral's provocation. The neutral, a word too many, un mot de trop. He uses this phrase a lot. Il, it, that sort of relay, that term that I referred to, that is a mot de trop, a word too many. Elsewhere he'll say death itself is a word too many. It's a word too many in relation to the discursive order. Fear is a word too many. Each time these are words that can't be taken in, or that have some excess about them that signal this presence of the neutral. The neutral, a word too many, and even as I say this, some of you are looking at me, I realize if you want to understand this, you're going to have to do a lot of this work on your own, working through these texts and thinking about it. I'm just trying to give you I'm giving you a path, so to speak. I'm giving you some pointers and some indicators in a path. So I realize that some of it is going to be very, very obscure, but yeah, you'll have to decide whether you want to take that. So, the neutral, a word too many that withdraws either by reserving a place for itself from which it is always missing, all the while marking itself there, or by provoking a displacement that is without place, or else by distributing itself in a multiple manner in a supplemental place. Very Derridian in some of the language he's using. The word too many. It would come from the other without ever having been heard by a self. Remember, the neutral, how strangely that sounds to me. Right? It would never be heard by a self, nonetheless the sole auditor possible, since it is meant for him, less to disperse or break him than to respond to the breaking or dispersal that the eye conceals, making of it itself a self by this movement of hiding that seems the beating of an empty heart. Where there is or would be a word too many, there is the offense and the revelation of death. So this is the writing of my death, that to which he had referred.
The death only in the sense of the second birth. The second.
Death in the sense of this. Remember, if we go back to the page 311, the end of that long passage that I picked up. Death, coming as other, nevertheless touching only what it has always already touched, having no actuality and only allowing itself to be encountered by the self that it haunts when the self, the stand-in for the other, is no more than the already broken fictive partner. So this is, so to speak, an other self, the self of the dying. That, if we think of the death of the author, the author giving itself over to an exposure to this movement in writing, which Blanchot calls dying. So that other self is the one to whom this word too many is given or comes as a gift. So
it's a new form of relationality, a new form of life that he's
yes.
trying to allude to. So, kind of like death, obviously, highly negative word for most people. So it's also you have to see the light beyond it.
Yeah. Or Rache is not life. Let me just finish this paragraph. So I read again those last lines. Not heard by a self, right? The word too many would come from the other without ever having been heard by a self. Nonetheless, the sole auditor possible, since it is meant for him, less to disperse or break him, than to respond to the breaking or dispersal that the eye conceals, making of itself a self by this movement of hiding that seems the beating of an empty heart. So he suggests that even the very constitution of a self entails a kind of eclipse of this other dimension of the self, to which, in fact, there could come something like this speaking of the word too many, or this revelation of the word too many. Where there is or would be a word too many, there is the offense and the revelation of death. That would be to write your death, to write out this exposure of the self and this coming of the other word. To write your death would be to write the word too many. Marcus, you wanted to?
Yeah, I have a question at the bottom of page 12, when you started writing. Why does he, I think the decisive word in the paragraphs is perhaps. So why does he say, thus we have perhaps indicated a neutral provocation? How does one read a perhaps? Because I think perhaps sort of radically calls everything into question.
Yeah, Derrida has done quite a lot with that, peut-être.
Yeah.
And this is very, it's very consistent in Blanchot when he starts talking about, because in a certain sense he's positing a relation there where no positing can occur. He's giving a theoretical account of something which he has just said discourse cannot capture. So the perhaps it modulates the positing and takes it into the space of a supposition. And you saw, I can't remember where it was now, but I was reading the word supposition. He's talking about the way the subject is supposed and kind of displaced in that supposition. So it's a whole meditation on the peculiar modality of thought when it entertains this relationality and seeks to entertain it by entering into the space. That's why it's close to what Heidegger was calling Vermutung. Because there's no knowing in the sense of conceptual comprehension or grasping. There's rather a kind of seeking relation with that which exceeds any kind of objectification or and seeks any relationality according to understanding. So there's a gesture of a kind of reaching out or supposing in the subjunctive sense. May the holy be my word. So all of this is attempting to seek relation where there is no relation in a traditional knowing sense, and where the thing exceeds being, right? Peut-être. It's that which with which one seeks relation without relation is not a being. It's outside the order of what is, and so again, it's trying to conceive a modality of relation that doesn't reify in that sense of objectification that we've been looking at. Last phrase then, in this, there's been a series, inscribe your death then, a kind of conclusion. Then in the next one, I seek the distance without concept, in order that death without truth may be inscribed there. And then there is a further reflection, and then finally something like a question which is equally something like an investiture. And listen to this. Will you, as a self, accept taking this self as problematic, as fictive? So will you give yourself up to it? And nonetheless, therefore, more necessary than if you were able to close up around yourself like a circle sure of its center. If you remember the responsibility to which I was trying to refer earlier, we might understand that necessity. Will you as a self accept taking this self as problematic, and so forth? Then, perhaps, in writing, you will accept, as the secret of writing, this premature yet already belated conclusion that is in accord with forgetting. That others write in my place, this place without occupant that is my sole identity, this is what makes death for an instant joyful or aleatory. So, as I say, the kind of investiture, will you accept as a self to be fictive? Yes, I accept. Then, perhaps, in writing, you will accept this, you will then receive, or you will be prepared to receive this secret, as the secret of writing, this premature yet already belated, in a certain sense it doesn't come on time for a reason, but in this strange temporality of the part. You will accept as the secret of writing this premature but yet already belated conclusion that is in accord with forgetting. And the conclusion again is that others write in my place. A kind of supposition. That others write in my place. This place without occupant that is my sole identity. This is what makes death for an instant joyful, aleatory.
Others are writing through him.
Yes. I accept death. Yes to death. Right?
Death of this fictive self.
I can accept yes to death because I accept this conclusion that others are writing in my place. In other words, that when I inscribe my death, when I give myself over to this act of inscription, that is this writing of Lacou-Labarthe, I work with the assumption, again, we're in the modality peut-être, we're in the modality of supposition, or assumption, that others are coming here to this place. And that's what makes death joyful. Hence I can affirm it. I can therefore affirm my death. So, je m'effacerai avec. Yeah,
Do we know anything about these others? Like, for example, does it contain like in the Heidegger's like earthly?
well, the others, you've got to read the book. I mean, it's going on and on about who these others might be, and to a certain extent, they are undefined, necessarily undefined. He doesn't want to give a determining figuration to them. It's a very radical hospitality to any and all. A little later on, in Lacou-Labarthe, there's a very similar kind of investiture that goes on, and but it's presented in various ways. But one of them is very playful, and I'm cited. It's just wonderful. I'm going to cite it again at the beginning of the text. As though there had sounded, in a muffled manner, that appeal, an appeal nevertheless joyous, the cry of children playing in the garden. Who is me today? Who will take the place of me? And the infinite, joyous response: him, him, him. So this aleatory displacement of the subject is expressed as infantile play, which sounds to me like the swallows in the gardens of Paris, screeching. And so it is really, there's a kind of, it's a giving over to a loss of self. Right? But at the same time, there's, you know, a joyous, aleatory, as in a game, where there's this opening to a kind of infantile relationality. Sometimes it's not so infantile, but nevertheless, there, it's just an absolutely gorgeous evocation of this opening of a relation in this loss of self. Somebody's written a book on that, those last couple phrases. Who is me today? Who will take the place of me? And I haven't found the book yet, but I'm really eager to see that. So, I've tried to suggest to you today two things about Lacou-Labarthe that I think are that are critical. That there is and I feel in some ways that I'm making it a bit too weighty, but that passage with the young girl is very weighty. There is something like an ethical responsibility that he's trying to define and to draw out and to enact through this writing, so that it is it is anything but a solitary act of bringing language to speak for itself. On the contrary, he sees this as this tracing of the threshold as an act of hospitality. This limit that is crossed with Lacou-Labarthe, that is traced with Lacou-Labarthe, this is an opening to the other via this threshold that is this writing. So, and then, the question is, okay, what is the condition of that? And we have just read some of this investiture by which the self accepts this task and then undertakes this task of writing and becoming this self as fictive partner of the other, by which there could be this reception of the word too many and the revelation of death, as he puts it. Now, I wanted to look at one other thing with you. This is a little bit of I wish I could carry on in the same vein, and really lay out for you how this text works. But at that point, it's just too difficult. This is like the opening conversation from the infinite conversation, but to the squared or to the third power. It's really very complicated. But I had been talking about this term, this relation to the neutral, and the possibility of an affirmative relation to this affect. So I wanted to read a couple of passages where Blanchot evokes this Lacou-Labarthe and this passage that I'm trying to think of. These come late in the text, and they come in those sections where Blanchot is trying to evoke these affects that I've described: fear, affliction, malheur, anxiety, angst, a series of terms by which the self experiences a disappropriation. He also uses the word fragility, again, which is interesting because, as I said, I'd never heard it elsewhere than in Blanchot and in Brache's talk the other day. I certainly know what fragilité means, but I'd never heard it described as or offered as a condition, almost a psychological condition that would be in a manual someplace. La fragilité, as opposed to angst or la peur. So, okay, there are a couple passages I will just read to you, and here's one of the first. If the self falls or fails under the affliction of all, the word is défaillance. So remember I was saying it's impossible for us to take on all the suffering of the world without collapsing, without going mad. So he writes this as follows: if the self fails under the affliction of all, affliction here, malheur, it risks being only the failing self, and extended by this affliction to the point of being the self of all, even as afflicted. So there is one way of thinking about affliction as something shared generally, which would be a kind of expansion of the ego or the self. Oh, I share everyone else's affliction. There you hear the self expanding itself. But affliction does not authorize the self, the afflicted I. So this is not an investiture in that sense. It's not an authorization, which leads one to think, only to think, the death. That affliction has always undone the self, substituting for it the other relation. This is, that we were just seeing that in the statements on the neutral, the other in relation to the self in relation to the other, or the neutral. So this leads us to think that affliction has always undone the self, substituting for it the other relation, other and with the other, and that it nevertheless cuts it off as a punctual singularity in which it does not have the right to be self, be this a singular self. So, in order to think this relationality of affliction, it says we can't think it in terms of a self expanding itself to contain all affliction, but perhaps we can understand affliction as having afflicted the self in such a way that it becomes a punctual singularity. It has no right to claim itself as a self, but is nevertheless there in some way, and as it goes on, only passable, that is an open, permeable, so to speak, only passable to the point of being removed from whatever suffering there is in passivity, from the common feeling of suffering, and nevertheless called through this passivity that is not suffered, not authorized to suffer, and as though exiled from suffering, to sustain the relation with the other who suffers. So there is a kind of, he suggests there's a sort of distance taken in suffering, by which a relation is therefore possible, which can be maintained. There's a distance within suffering by this afflicted self that the self could take over without being, taking it on as being responsible for it, as the self of all. The pa of the completely passive, pa, step or not, the pa of the completely passive, the pa au-delà, is rather the folding back, unfolding itself of a relation of strangeness that is neither suffered nor assumed, a transgressive passivity, a dying where nothing is suffered, nothing acted upon, which is unconcerning and takes name only through the abandonment of the dying of the other. This one is very obscure, obviously, and it's not going to get a whole lot better if I read this 3 or 4 times, but he seems to suggest that there is a relation in affliction by which the self would become this punctual singularity that sustains or maintains a relation in affliction, which has the character of a folding of some kind. The pa of the completely passive. So this subject, this self, is suffering in a form of passivity that removes it from suffering in the everyday sense and opens this other relation. And in this passivity, this suffering of this other relation, the pa of the completely passive, the pa au-delà, is rather the folding back, unfolding itself of a relation of strangeness that is neither suffered nor assumed. So there's a fold in this relation, a turn of some kind. It's not reflection, but there is a folding. A transgressive passivity, a dying where nothing is suffered, nothing acted upon, which is unconcerning and takes name only through the abandonment of the dying of the other. Here's a case of what I was trying to say. It's not a concept. In fact, these words only come to words in and through this relation to the dying of the other. So, le pa au-delà is said only in this relation that he's described, in this folding, strange relation. Let me read the way I commented on this, because that is so dense that I'm afraid I'm leaving you just baffled, and I don't want to do that in the last minutes. Not that I'm going to break everything clear, but maybe I can deal with it.
So which page is it?
This page is 122 in English, 167 in French.
122.
122. So, I summarized this in my own text. I summarized this as follows. Caution is given against a movement of self-authorization in this movement that he comes to call le pa au-delà, this lapsing into a form of self-expansion. He's trying to caution against that self-expansion. But affliction, Blanchot affirms, does not authorize the self, which leads to the thought that the self has always already been displaced in affliction. For its self-relation, for the self-relation of the self, there has been substituted relation with the other that reduces the self to a singular punctuality whose trait is a passibility. A passivity that takes in suffering. And as it takes almost as in a, like in a, how could I say, almost in a chemical reaction. Suddenly something takes, or an adhesion takes. It's something that occurs, right? It's not taking in that sense, but something that happens almost in an event. So this is a passivity that takes in suffering through its very opening and receptivity to the other, to the point of separating in and from this suffering, and taking thereby the task of sustaining the relation to the suffering other. So we suffer with, but there's a fold in that suffering, by which this fold in and through passivity, in suffering that relation, by which there's a separation, a distance opens. Separation, we should underscore, is the separation from the common feeling of suffering, and it is therefore tempting to assume that a step has been made here in relation to the notion of compassion. The last section of the passage makes it clear that this would indeed be Lacou-Labarthe, that the affliction in question is inseparable from a form of dying. It emphasizes, moreover, that the substitution that we're seeing, this taking over of the relation, is a movement that is not a fold of self-reflection, but nonetheless a folding in exposure that makes it possible for Blanchot to speak of relation to the other. This is a relation of speech. The punctual being is called to sustain relation in a movement wherein dying takes name in Lacou-Labarthe. Okay? I'm trying to talk about the constitution of a relation in and through this speaking, in and through this advent of the phrase Lacou-Labarthe, through this fold that he calls this, through this folding that he describes in suffering with the other in this affliction, where the self is no longer the self of an ego, but that punctual singularity in relation to the other. All right. I'm not even going to look at your faces to see if you're following me there. I'm going to go a little bit farther. This is a case where, a passage where Blanchot is talking again about malheur, affliction. And it's a very, in a certain sense, it's perfectly obvious what that is, but it's also, what does it mean? Malheur means misfortune, unhappiness, but also affliction in the sense of you're going through extreme suffering. Something has come over you that provokes an extreme suffering.
Page 130.
Page 125 in English, 171 in French. Affliction, malheur. This word that befalls us without giving an explanation and without allowing us to respond to it. Destiny without destiny. We can do nothing against affliction. So it speaks to us through its muteness. But even if there is no action capable of effacing it, no gaze to fix it, are we not allowed to sense that there would be a passivity more passive than that by which we suffer it, and from which it would be given to us to withdraw from it this trait of natural fatality, of a speech unpronounced but forever said, that it represents for us? Perhaps thought is, in its most passive passion, more afflicted than all affliction, being so for still being thought in the face of the affliction that reaches it in others. Passivity that leaves a certain distance to respond to it, there where, pretending to escape any cause, social, historical, or ethical, or at least always to exceed it, it affirms itself in its somber sovereignty in ruins. Yes, perhaps. Only perhaps. Marcus's question is certainly getting its echo here. Again, it's extremely precarious. He emphasizes this modality of perhaps. And what is so precarious is this assertion that thought might enter into affliction in such a way as, well, to be, as he says, to be more afflicted than any affliction, insofar as it is the thought of affliction. So thought would enter into affliction, into this mute suffering that comes over us. But thought would assume it in such a way as to, as he says, to remove from it this trait of natural fatality, in a certain sense, to give us to recognize that there is no such thing as a natural affliction. affliction is always from the other, in some way, from other human being. And remove from it that sense of a destiny, a fatality, something natural that comes over us, and to give it to us as something that, well, again, as something of thought, whereby speech might become possible. If we take away from it that sense of a natural fatality and the muteness that belongs to it, that this would seem to release the possibility of the speech. So he's again, it's like that description of affliction that I read to you a moment ago, where the thought that there's a movement by which a fold occurs in the relation of affliction, and a separation occurs, and hence a distance by which some distance from affliction could open within affliction. Right? Here he's saying that this distance could become the distance of a speaking, whereby we could release ourselves from that destiny or that fatality which tells us that there is no speech possible in this suffering. So it is there is a kind of, by this, and this is what I was calling, I was linking to what Lacan and Deleuze call humour and mitsein, a strange way of assuming the affliction in such a way as to move in and through it, beyond it. And this is, I think, what Blanchot is quoting here, or thinking here. I'll just read it one last time. Affliction, this word that befalls us without giving an explanation, without allowing us to respond to it. Destiny without destiny. We can do nothing against affliction, so it speaks to us through its muteness. We are oppressed by affliction in this sense. It tells us that no language is possible. We suffer it. But even if there is no action capable of effacing it, no gaze to fix it, are we not allowed to sense that there would be a passivity more passive than that by which we suffer it, and from which it would be given to us to withdraw from it this trait of natural fatality, of a speech unpronounced but forever said that it represents for us? Perhaps thought is, in its most passive passion, more afflicted than all affliction, being so for still being thought in the face of the affliction that reaches it in others. Passivity that leaves a certain distance to respond to it, there where, pretending to escape any cause, or at least always to exceed it, it affirms itself in its somber sovereignty, in ruins. Yes, perhaps, only perhaps. The very last sentence is especially interesting in relation to what I was trying to say the other night in my talk about the political relation. Malheur, he suggests here, pretends to escape any cause, right? Social, historical, or ethical. So if we were to find a way to respond to it, we might challenge that claim to be outside any socio-historical or ethical relationality. Or we might bring it into a social, historical, or ethical relationality, even though it does exceed the order of meaning or the political. In that sense, speech, if thought could bring affliction to speech, it would be transforming this supposed silence in relation to the social and historical or the ethical. You see what I'm saying?
You mean thought brings speech to affliction?
Yes, because affliction, as it presents itself, as he's saying here, it presents itself as a destiny or a fatality. We are held mute,
about which we can say nothing.
and we can do and say nothing in relation to
it.
It overcomes us as a power that seems external to us and completely. And that is, the people in the camps are suffering a form of affliction, right?
Unless thought becomes more afflicted than affliction.
Thought has to face affliction, enter into it in a way to become, as he says, more afflicted than affliction, and then perhaps
find space.
It finds the space in which there could be, it could overcome that way in which affliction seems to silence us. Right? And this is one of the things that Blanchot emphasized in the essays on Antelme, is that Antelme recognized you must not surrender to the idea that this oppressive power is natural. No, this comes from human beings, and they are human beings like us, and that is the condition of some sort of survival or deliverance in relation to this oppression. And so I think he may be thinking of that here. I think the thought is somewhat linked. he refuses the idea of affliction as being some sort of natural force overcoming it to which we succumb.
Well, sometimes it would be like flooding or natural disasters, but
Yeah, but again,
well, okay.
but again, the question is how what affliction it brings as a human experience of it, and so he's suggesting that we there would be a way of inhabiting it or entering into it, which would overcome that that appearance of a natural force, of an overwhelming force, so that in a certain sense we release it to its human, or that human and extra-human dimension, and thereby question its pretension of escaping any cause, social, historical, or ethical. So that's not to say we bring it, we make it a social issue, a historical issue, or an ethical issue, but that our way of speaking will challenge that muteness in relation to the social, historical, or political. And he's inviting us to bring it back into that relation in some way, but from an extra political place. You see what I'm saying?
Back into politics from an extra political.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to call for in my essay 2 nights ago. Now, how's that possible? How's that possible? And this is, in about 8 minutes, I'm going to read one last text. It has to do with the relation to the neutral. How could one enter affliction in such a way as to have this fold occur, or have this emergence of speech occur? That's the question, and that's the question I was asking. How could there be this turn? Will the interruption of the discourse and, in the same movement, affirm something? Right? How can this turn occur? It has something to do with the relation to the neutral. And here I'm going to read a very difficult passage, but he is suggesting that the relation to the neutral is always, at some level, an affirmative one. So that even as in our most extreme passivity of affliction, there is already an affirmation. An affirmation has already occurred and is taking form.
What's the page in English?
The page in English would be 118 and 119. I'm going to skip the center part of this passage and just read the beginning and the end. He says, to the neutral would respond the fragility, there's that fragilité, the fragility of what is already breaking. Remember how he describes the self as it enters into relation with the word too many. It is a breaking self that receives this word too many. To le neutre would respond the fragility of what is already breaking. Passion, more passive than anything that would be passive. Yes, that has said yes before affirmation, as though the passage of dying had always already passed there, preceding consent. To le neutre, name without name, nothing responds, save the response that fails. There's the défaillance that we were reading before in Affliction. That has always almost responded and failed in the response, never patient enough to pass beyond, without this step beyond being accomplished. Transgression, I'm going to the end of the passage now, transgression, this movement, is not a simple letting go. Not that it decides and reposing on power would there exceed power by chance and sovereignty, even onto the impossible. Transgression transgresses by passion, patience, and passivity, always transgressing the most passive of ourselves in that dying in the likeness of dying that escapes our presence and by which we would escape ourselves without being able to escape. Passivity, patience, passion, which have renounced the disquiet of the negative, its impatient stirring, its nevertheless infinite errancy, and thus would withdraw from le neutre that withdrawal in which its negative signaling still leaves it. Now, I don't have time to comment on this in all its challenge, but he seems to be saying that in passivity, which is already affirmation, already acquiescence in some way, already a saying yes to the dying that is overcoming it, there is it is so patient that it suspends the negative of the neutral itself. If the neutral presents itself always as neither this nor that, ni l'un, ni l'autre, constantly other than whatever we might try to posit as determining it in some sense. So it appears, le neutre is given, and if you look at the passages that I quoted for you, it's an endless negation. It's not this, it's not that, we might think it's this, no, it's not that, it's, le neutre is given only by negation, in a kind of neither this, nor that, nor that, nor that, nor that, nor that, nor that. And here he suggests there would be in passivity as this experience of dying, which he describes too in many different ways, and which I've been alluding to, there would be in this passivity both an affirmation and a renunciation of the disquiet of the negative. It would receive the neutral in such a way as there would no longer be this me. Right? And thus, as he says, and he's challenging his own, he dares to conclude something at this point, and thus would withdraw from the neutre that withdrawal in which its negative signaling still leaves it. So this would be a suspension of that negation that is proper to the neutral. Renounces the disquiet of the negative. That is almost a negation of negation, right? Almost an aufhebung, but not quite. It's more like a suspension of the neutre's way of withdrawing it, so that the neutre would no longer be withdrawn in that manner anyway. There would be a kind of, again, relation without relation to the neutre, which would be the presence of the neutre. And if it is present without negation, then there would be something like an incipient. Well, affirmation without affirmation. Right? And the affirmation that has already occurred would presumably be redoubling that affirmation, and hence we have the yes of je m'effacerai. Right? Maybe, perhaps. But what I'm trying to say is that he says it in a way that I just don't see him saying it elsewhere. There would be a relation with the neutre, which suspends and delivers. And that would be the condition of coming to speech, of speaking beyond that afflicting, silencing, overwhelming character of the affect, affliction, fear, whatever that series, however we fatigue, all the ones that I have enumerated for the various moments. If we enter that, the abyssal character of those forms of affect, fear, weariness, fatigue, affliction, anguish, and so forth. If we enter that abyssal character, we move into this dying, which becomes the relation to the neutre. And in the passivity of that relation, there would be perhaps this term. And that's the possibility of an affirmation, which is not a negation, and which is not a negation, not a denial of the affliction, but rather moving in and through the affliction into a speaking that would bring that speaking, or that would bring that affliction as a common affliction, because he says fear is shared, affliction is shared, so forth. It would bring it to speech, therefore it would be communicating that for all. And so it is, in that way, an affirmation that could be then engaging the ethico-political relation. Okay?
Do you know if
no more questions? No.
Do you know if Badiou has found this kind of perspective interesting in his project?
I have no idea. But I heard he was talking about affirmative dialectic last week.
Yeah, I thought you weren't there, were you?
No.
I thought it was relevant.
Finally, he's been reading me, Jonathan. That's all I can say.
What?
Finally, he's been reading me. No.
Relevant.
Yeah. No, I would love to have heard that last night, but I couldn't. And I wouldn't be surprised. He's a reader of Lacan. And certainly Blanchot. So very possibly, but and all the better if he is. Let's welcome that.